Hey everyone, today we are building a DNA75c dual 18650. The feature of this episode is the new ABM-2 enclosure, the perfect dual 18650 enclosure. I say new, we've had ABM-2s before, but we've been sold out for a while of the DNAC cutout, the color screen here for the 75C or the 250C. The new model here has a recessed 510, and this combination isn't one that we sell a lot of kits. This 75C with dual batteries, we sell a lot of 75Cs in the ABM-1 enclosure single battery, but you can go dual batteries. They're wired in parallel, whereas this enclosure also fits the 250C, but then the batteries are wired in series. So stick around and we're going to build this thing. So the first thing we'll start with is the battery sled, and we'll introduce a bit of a safety feature. I did it on this sled here. I'm using two 15 amp fuses, so 30 amps, to bridge the either side. I'm going to do it on the bottom of the sled. I don't bother with the DNA 250s, 250Cs because the batteries are in series, but in parallel, if you accidentally put in one of the batteries wrong, you're causing a dead short. So you got your sled here in parallel, this side's jumpered, let's say it's your positive, this side's also jumpered, and let's say this is your negative. If you happen to insert one of the batteries the wrong way, you've got plus to minus to plus to minus, you got a dead short. It's happened to me. Scary thing. The contacts start glowing red hot. If you're lucky, it'll melt the solder and it'll disconnect the sled. But so for that reason, when in parallel, we'll jumper one side of the sled with these fuses. If that happens, it'll jump and cut the circuit. So we'll tin. Ooh, another thing I'll do, which I don't normally do, I'll bring my solder spool into view so you can see me load up the solder on the iron. In all the other vids, you see the soldering iron go off screen. I didn't want anyone to think that the flux that I use was some kind of solder paste and then I was just melting that with the iron. This is flux, and I still apply solder onto the iron, so that'll be visible now. Alright, so we'll tin. I'm going to tin both sides of the contacts where the fuses will go, and I'll tin more on the bottom here where I'll attach our negative wire. It'll feed out this way. if you have to, gently bend the little tabs on the fuse down a bit. I'm going to throw on my Michael Jackson glove, because I'll want to hold that with my thumb, and it's going to get pretty hot. Should have applied some flux onto that tab. Try that again. Nice contact. And the other side. Good. I'll do the other one. Alright, and while I'm here, I'll attach the negative wire. And by the way, I wouldn't attempt this on a 3D printed sled. Just the heat of that iron and the melted solder is enough to warp the plastic. These Mossmax sleds are like a injection molded nylon, I think. Still don't want to leave the iron on there too long, which is why I pre-tinned everything, and this way the melted solder that's on the iron, just as soon as it touches, it bonds everything together. So keep that in mind. Alright, I'm happy with that. Like to use some alcohol to wipe off the sticky flux residue. Now for the other side, I might end up regretting this, but my plan is to jumper the two contacts, and I want to use this bottom channel under here, because on the DNA board both the battery pads are on the bottom, so I want to bridge the top and then onto that bridged wire, solder another wire going straight down, which I'll run down this groove, and it'll pop out here, and I'll have my 2 battery wires on the bottom, which are right beside where they go. So again, I'll tin these. I'm going to tin these right on the bottom back of the contact here. So I'm just going to strip and tin the whole thing, but I'll do it half at a time. I'm going to try and get it under there. I'm happy with that. And then right down the channel. Just to keep that in the channel, throw a piece of tape over there. being careful not to cut through the insulation when I get into that channel there. All right, that's it for the sled. All right, let's wire up the 510 next. I went 18 gauge on the battery side for the DNA75, that's all right. I'm going 16 gauge on the output, or the 510. I like to squeeze the spring, the pin down, so it exposes more the top of the 510. It'll be easier to solder and not accidentally get iron all over not accidentally get solder all over the nut here. I don't know if you can see, I want, when the wire's all the way in, I want at least 2 millimeter, say a 1/16 of an inch of wire protruding, so I can get the iron on there, like in between the top here, and so I'm going to bare another little bit. It's pretty nice. And now the board. In fact, I'll do nothing to the board right now. Let's temporarily mount it in the enclosure. Then we'll measure our lengths. We'll cut, we'll tin. I mentioned, actually I don't know which video will come out first. Our board holders used to be 3D printed ABS, but in the last run of enclosures we had made, we also had some, most of the board holders, machined at a POM plastic. It's a popular plastic, easy to machine. So these are nice and new and a big time savings for me. I don't have to 3D print all of those. Let's get all of these cut and tinned. Okay, we'll get the board back out of there and start soldering. I like to prime the pads with a bit more solder. Okay, I'll pre-solder the 510. If I'd be soldering the wire this way, I wouldn't pre-wire the negative. But because I'm coming at it this way, that'll be hard to do once the board, so I'll pre-solder both of these. The battery sled will be coming in this way. The negative's easy because it's on top. I can't do the red even if I'd want to. Well, maybe I could, but then this would be attached and it'd be awkward. So I'll do both of these once the board's mounted in the enclosure. The screen, I don't know if I mention it every build video, but there's a little hinge, kind of a little door on the connector. So gently lift that open. Then you'll be able to slide the ribbon into that connector. We want it to end up like this. So screen side down. Then gently snap that little door shut. I think I'll go black actuators. Get your board mount lifted a bit and you want to slide your ribbon under it just like that. Don't tighten them all the way yet, you'll see why in a second. Now that bottom nut can be hard to get in there, especially if there's even more components in the mod at this point. So what I do, the flux that kind of dries on the tip of the applicator is really sticky. So I'll use that to hold the nut. I mentioned not to tighten the screws down all the way just yet. If you need to, well, that's pretty dead center. I was going to say there can be a bit of play up and down with the screen, but no, that's perfect. To give you time to make a slight adjustment before locking everything down. Make sure none of your buttons are binding. The fire button is a little too tight. All right. To keep the sled in there, my preferred way is with double-sided tape. If you ever need to remove it, it's not easy, but still easier than if you epoxy the sled down. There's this external grade double-sided tape that's really strong, so I like to use this stuff. And we'll just put a little strip on the top and bottom. Before we even glue that in there, let me get the 510 out of the way. All right, sled. Now if you bend the wires, you should be able to get them right on top of the pad. Not sure if you can see that in there. And we'll just, both are tin, the wire and the pad, so we'll just come hit that with a blob of solder. It'll melt everything together. And same for the negative. Again, if you can see that, might hold this one with my thumb. All right, that's pretty clean in there. Let's get some batteries in here and try it out. Actually, before the batteries, let's get our magnets in there. I like to mention it as often as I can. It's really easy to mess up the polarity on the magnets, and then the lid will repel. Even if you just mess up one of them, they're practically impossible to get out of there after the fact. So what I do, get the 4 magnets in a stack. I mark the opposite ends. And we're feeding from the unmarked end, and that goes down in the holes. And before putting each one in, make sure that you're on the right side of the stack. The same for the lid. Just using CA glue, crazy glue. Checking my stack. Last one, marked side down. Same for the lid, feeding from the unmarked side. Our mark is down. We'll give that, in fact, I'll give it at least an hour before I bother putting the lid on there. And then we'll come back, throw some batteries in, and give it a try. Okay, I actually haven't tightened down the 510, so let's do that. And I don't think I ever went into detail on how to use the 510 tool. It's a little counterintuitive. You want to expose enough thread on this side to screw into the 510, but you need to leave some room on this side, because when we remove the 510, you'll actually, this is the counterintuitive part, you're going to tighten, and I'll explain why in a sec. So you need some room to be able to tighten down a bit here. So I usually go about halfway. Hold it by the nut, not the top one, the bottom one. Use a pair of pliers. I shaved down a wrench here, make it easier. So I'm going to hold the nut with that, And then I'm going to hold the inside nut, that is. I'm going to hold this outside nut with some vice grips. Be careful. If you slip, you might scratch up the top finish here. So I kind of go on an angle, make sure my vice grips don't protrude outside of the 510. So you tighten the big nut. And to remove it, so the big nut is sandwiched down onto the top of the 510. To release it, if we screw the top part in, it's going to relieve the pressure off of the nut here. And then we'll be able to unscrew the nut and get this thing out of here. So I'm going to hold the big nut with the vice grips. And like a quick shot inwards. It's not always the case. A lot of times that'll unlock it. This seems to be loose enough now that but that's the counterintuitive part. If you're unscrewing and it doesn't seem to be loosening, go the other way. It'll unlock that bottom nut and then you can get the whole thing off. Okay. The nice thing about parallel is you can run with just one of them. I remember I got little hands. This is a nice sized mod. The new ABM-2 Enclosure, the perfect dual 18650 enclosure around. Look at the efficient use of all the space in there. Recessed 510. Went with the anodized silver enclosure. This thing a quick vape. Another thing I'll mention here, there's no need to tighten down your 510 very much. If you do, and after the heating and expansion, and you unscrew it, you run the risk of loosening the 510 nut. So tighten it down, but don't go overboard on tightening it. That's great. So DNA75c, I've been doing a lot of 2700s lately. Figured I'd bring it back to 18650s to feature the ABM-2 enclosure. Parallel batteries wired. This same enclosure, perfect for the 250 or 250C. Except, of course, the batteries are wired in series, and then there's the balanced charging pins to wire as well. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.